3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Hello, how are you doing, Steve?
Fine, thank you.
Brilliant. So would you like to introduce yourself for all of our listeners?
Yeah, my name is Steve Turner and I am the Conservative candidate for May's Police and Crime Commissioner elections.
Brilliant, brilliant. So you're the Police and Crime Commissioner election, May 6th. I have spoken with Barry Cooper yesterday, so there'll be a few points that I can bounce off. But yeah, you're running for May 6th. Would you like to, briefly as you can, just let me know what the Police and Crime Commissioner does and anybody out there who might not know?
Yeah, I think it's important to know first and foremost what it isn't, and that it's not an operational role. You are not in charge of operational policing. That's the Chief Constable's role, and it's right that it is. What you do have complete autonomy over is how you set that strategy. So the direction you want the force to take, the priorities you set out for the Chief Constable, the plans you make with them, you then hold them to account to. So you agree a way forward for Cleveland Police with them, and they go away and they deliver it operationally for you. The second strand to it is the budgeting element. You are in charge of a £145 million budget. Most of that goes on police officers' wages and buildings and cars, but everything, the vehicles they drive, the kit they use, the back office staff, that's all within that, as well as the victim services things you commission. So whether that's a team to work with domestic abuse victims, whether you're looking at human trafficking, or whether it's something like a burglary or harassment or at low level, anybody that's been a victim of crime, the Police and Crime Commissioner supports services that help those people. And within that, it's so varied. So you might be looking at engagement work for young people, which is something I'm keen on doing, right through to, like I said, to domestic abuse or human trafficking. The third element of the police and crime role is where it becomes political, and I understand a lot of people don't believe it should be a political role. Now, for me, that's not about the party you represent or who you work with. It's more about the fact that you have to be the face of Cleveland Police. You're the one that's got to work with the media, you've got to work with the press, you've got to work with local councils, local officials. Like we talked about the services that provide work for victims, you've got to commission them and you've got to work with them. And you've got to go up over as well, you've got to work with central government. So whether that's talking to the policing minister, to the Home Secretary, to the Justice Secretary, or local MPs and national MPs, if you've got a cause you want to champion or something you want to do or something that needs to change, it's important that you understand how that role works and what levers you can and can't pull.
Do you feel as though the reason why people feel as though a candidate having a political affiliation might not necessarily be the best thing is because they think that you may bring bias to the table? And how could you address that and clear that up for people who worry?
I understand that. I think people's biggest fear is that their police force becomes politicised. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's important to understand that it's the Chief Constable's role to direct operational policing. So people might have a fear, for example, that if you've got a Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner, then if you don't live in a Conservative ward, you're not going to see as good policing as you would if you did live in it. And that's just absolute rubbish, because the Chief Constable doesn't allow that to happen. There is no politics in the actual policing. Mm-hmm. And then it's also fundamental to understand that with the role, regardless of whether you're affiliated to a political party or whether you're not affiliated to anybody, you still have to work with other people. So if you're an independent, you still have to work with Labour and Conservative councillors. If you're a Liberal Democrat, you've still got to go pitch to central government, which is a Conservative government. If you're a Labour PCC in our area right now, you've still got to work with Conservative MPs. So by not being willing to work with those people, you're making your job so much harder. So it's not in anybody's interest. If we want an effective police force, it's in nobody's interest to make that politically biased.
Yeah, and do you feel as though being part of a constituency and being part of a political affiliation allows you to some extent to have the correct network and links with people in Parliament and people who can help to better the area, and being within that network is better than being without that network to some extent?
I think in this current election, with the current candidates we have, then I am best placed with the best contact diary, if you like, the best black book, numbers to be able to talk to people. I mean, I've worked for a former government minister in the Treasury and Ministry of Housing Communities, so I understand what, when you're trying to get time with a minister, what that takes and what that means, and what you're trying to achieve from that. And so, as well as having those links, I've got that experience and that understanding from being able to do that, and that's really important. So in this election, as we look at the 4 candidates we look at, then certainly I think I am well qualified to be able to tick that particular box. Yeah,
that's actually what I was going to ask you. Would you care to let me know what your background and experience is overall with regards to this particular position?
I think, again, it goes back to what the role is and what the role isn't. So there is a lot of people think, well, it should be a police officer or an ex-police officer. Again, there's pros and cons in anything. And if you're an ex-police officer and you're looking at it from what it used to be like when you were a police officer, so A, you're looking at operational matters that you can't affect. B, you've got links into that police force that sometimes will be good, sometimes won't be so good. And C, you maybe don't understand the public element of it and the commercial element. Now, my background is in retail, senior management. So I spent a lot of time working across multiple sites, managing hundreds of people, managing £1 million budgets. I mean, my last role before I worked in politics full time, was managing 600 people across an estate that turned over £1 million a week.
Yeah.
And everything that went with that. Now, the strategy, the project management, the HR element, the people management, and being able to talk to different people, whether you're talking to a customer in a store or whether you're talking to a buyer in South Africa, it doesn't really, you've got to have that skill set to be able to do that. And I spent over 25 years doing that. Moving into the last 5 years or so of my political career. So I ran the referendum campaign for Vote Leave up here in the North East. I was regional director for that. So I understand how a political campaign works. I've worked on the front line for MPs since 2017, so looked at every aspect of casework. So I've worked with residents on casework, supporting them. I've worked on them with different projects, and like I said, there's 2 years of that where I worked for a government minister. So again, you're looking at that side of it, and all of the time being front facing, doing media work, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes, whether that's with press releases, whether that's looking at how a story breaks and interviewing different people. So it's a wide variety of skills you need to be a PCC that very rarely come from where people assume it does come from. So I know some fantastic police officers who are terrible people managers, right? And then I know some terrible people managers that find themselves managing lots of people, and but they can't talk in public. You've got to be able to talk in public. You've got to be able to do community meetings. Whoever you are in this role, you've got to be thick-skinned, because whoever wins the election, best part of 50% of the people that voted didn't vote for you, potentially. So you straight away, you're on a hiding to nothing. If you're part of a political party, there will always be a chunk of another political party that don't want to give you the time of day, and you've got to ride that. I've taken some pretty serious flack and abuse over the last 12 months just for being a candidate.
Yeah, I can imagine you certainly do see it, and a lot of it goes on social media, unfortunately. One thing that I would ask you is, do you feel as though if you could have went back and got some experience in the police, do you feel as though that would have added, or do you feel as though it could have been a detriment, or do you feel as though it's neither here nor there? You're already fit logistically, and you're already capable enough to secure the position, and that experience is not necessary to some extent.
I think you can make an argument either way. I could sit here and make an argument if I'd been a police officer and make an argument for it. Personally, as Cleveland Police stands today, I think if you've been an officer in Cleveland Police Force, then you are probably looked at in some quarters, not in all quarters, rightly or wrongly, you are possibly looked at as part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Cleveland Police Force has a terrible reputation right now. Now, by and large, that's not the ordinary everyday officers most people see. They've had a serious problem in the past with middle and senior management. It's been addressed, but it's well documented. Cleveland Police has been a basket case in some respects for the last 10, 12 years. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's got to be put right. I believe that somebody who's been part of that would find it really difficult to view that objectively. Mm. And I think we are a part of the public that would think, well, I used to work with him, so what's been said there, what's gone on there, he's part of the problem. He's never going to fix that because he's his mate. Mm. And then you get into the realms of if you've got some operational knowledge as well. So if you're coming into a PCC role, and let's face it, you'd have had to have been a senior police officer to understand how Cleveland Police works and where it was going wrong, because that's not something your average PC would know. But then you're into the realms of you're in your head, you're making operational decisions, and the role isn't operational in any way, shape or form. So by not having any police experience, I am not going to stray into the realms of operational policing. Mm-hmm. And by having a business background, I know chapter and verse how to hold somebody to account for targets that they've been set. Yeah. How you measure them, how you review them, how often you review them, how to set targets that everybody's comfortable with and everybody knows are achievable. Because there's no point sitting there and telling the chief constable you want unicorns on a Friday if he can't deliver that for you. So you've got to agree what is practical and what is possible, and make sure that fits your plan. And if your plan is more ambitious than that, then you've got to say, right, well, how do we get there? What do we need to get there? Yeah, it's not just looking ideas out of thin air.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit like saying you could get hired for a role in a factory, for instance, as a higher up, a senior level manager, and you wouldn't necessarily have had to work on the production line and done any of the hands-on stuff to understand the operations and to understand how they run, and then to introduce new initiatives that may be effective and help overall production.
Even within the police force today, if you've got the right degree and the right level of experience at say director level of a multinational company, mm-hmm. you can actually go into the police force as a direct hire at superintendent level. Yeah. Right. So we're employing senior police officers who haven't got any police experience. Now, you can argue rights or wrongs of that, but the further up any chain you get, whether that's in the police force, the fire brigade, the national health, whatever it is, it's more about people skills and people management and business acumen than it is about day-to-day policing. We've got fantastic coppers out there. Let them be fantastic coppers, and let's put people in to do the. I'm not a police officer, so I'll never be a great police officer. Most police officers will never step into that senior leadership role, so will never need to be senior leaders. So it's horses for courses, and this role is fundamentally not defined by whether or not you've been a police officer in the past. Yeah,
it's a little bit like so when I finished my law degree, the options that I had, I could have went into the military, and going into the military with a law degree automatically put you at a higher ranking. I don't know exactly what it is, but working within military law and working on all those different aspects, you can automatically be put higher up. So, the background and experience, that's a given to some extent. It's an assumption that you've got the correct qualifications and skill set necessary to actually get to those higher positions. And one thing I was going to ask is, I understand that these elections, they only started running around 2012, and with the first election, there wasn't much of a turnout rate nationally. I understand that the second one in 2016, it was a little bit better, but I think it was 43% or something for the nation. And do you feel as though exposure, visibility, and understanding for voters is low? And if so, how do you feel as though that should be tackled so that more of the nation actually understand these elections and when to vote, who to vote for, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think because there is a lack of understanding of what the role brings. One of the real common misconceptions, one of the big things people say is, we don't need a police and crime commissioner. Let's spend that salary and put more bobbies on the beat. Right? That's fine. That's a view. But the reality of it is, some of the roles that are done by the Police and Crime Commissioner's office would have to be done by somebody. So somebody would have to manage those finances. Somebody would have to manage that HR. Somebody would have to manage those victim services, and somebody would have to front up to the public on a regular basis. Now, is that the Chief Constable? Well, it could be, but is that the best use of a Chief Constable? Well, I don't think it is. Mm-hmm. So I think having somebody there is a real benefit. Now, what we've never done as a nation, if you like, and certainly not locally, is we haven't had PCCs who are willing to come to the forefront and say, right, this is what my role is. This is what I'm going to do for you. So everybody makes promises at election time. It's a common misconception that that's what they do. But if you look in our area, if you look at somebody like Ben Houchin and what he's done for the Tees Valley Mayor, he came in, he made a series of promises, he's delivered on all of them. But more importantly, what he's done is he's taken that position, because lots of people in the Tees Valley didn't want another layer of local government that didn't see what the benefit would be. Mm-hmm. But what we've got now is we've got a man in an office that's delivering on what their promises, and people are starting to see tangible benefits from that. And that's what I want to take into the PCC's role. And it becomes less about what is the PCC and more about what is our current PCC actually delivering. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is. And I'm up for being scrutinised and measured and held to account for that. Mm-hmm. Because then I think when it comes to three, and it is only a 3-year term, this one, not a 4-year term. Oh, yeah. I think when it comes to the next election, I can stand there and say, right, judge me on what I've done, rather than talking to people about this is what a PCC is. Yeah. Now,
certainly, as you mentioned, Ben Houchin and Andy Preston too, they, in my opinion, have certainly brought up the standards of Teesside and Cleveland. They've done a lot, as you said, and they've met a lot of promises. And they feel as though with that standard, naturally the expectations and standard of the police, should rise with it. And with that, from your perspective, what are the key issues, either statistically or subjectively, what are the key issues that you see around Cleveland, and how do you feel as though those should be challenged and tackled?
So it's interesting you say statistically and subjectively, because if you base something on statistics, so we're high for violent crime, we've got a horrendous drugs problem, we've got a real problem with missing and vulnerable children, and this and that, and those things are all important. We've got to get to grips with those. If you walk around a community and you talk to people on the streets, they're more bothered about antisocial behaviour. Mm-hmm. Off-road motorbikes, gangs of youth congregating, people setting wheelie bins alight, and it is that low-level crime, for want of a better description for it, that really gets to people, because that impacts their life. If drugs is a massive problem, and it's something we've got to do, but drugs only really impacts people, or the vast majority of people, when they see it being dealt on their streets. So if you're walking little Johnny to school and there's a drug dealer on the corner, you're horrified, and you think, well, if I wasn't here, would they be trying to pass my son or daughter drugs? What are they doing? Who are they getting hooked on? So then it impacts your life. When you talk about the drug problem in Cleveland from a statistical perspective, Nobody talks about that drug dealer on the street corner. People talk about county lines and getting Mr. Big and this, that, and the other. I want to see us make an impact at that level, at that community level. So I want people in Cleveland to say, you know what, that Steve Turner came in as police and crime commissioner, and I feel safer walking our streets, and I see less drug dealers, and I see less antisocial behaviour. And if we can achieve that, that's a massive task. The flip side of that is Cleveland police are inspected on the Peel report with the worst police force in the country. We've allowed it to deteriorate through a lack of leadership and a lack of strategy. And we're getting measured on that as well. So we've got to fix the stuff at that end. Now, fixing most of that stuff, your average person in the street won't see, right? But it's important, and it's important the Chief Constable gets it right. But we've got to work at the other end of the scale as well, and almost meet in the middle. So Cleveland Police is a problem of that starts at both ends. It starts with not accepting antisocial behaviour, it's criminal behaviour. And at the other end, it's making sure we have the procedures in place to ensure that we're hitting the right measures in all of the stuff that people don't see on a day-to-day basis as well.
Yeah, I touched on the point a little bit yesterday with Barry, and we discussed about drugs and drug issues. And I think my question to him was, I'm guessing that it's going to be a mixture, but what would you say is more appropriate, more punitive measures for drug dealers and people on the street to reduce the visibility and to punish justly, or incentives from grassroots positions to stop it like from the start, from it even getting worse or manifesting into these problems that you see on the streets? And as I say, it can be a mixture of the two. But do you feel as though one's more weighted than the other in terms of what can actually be done realistically?
I think at the minute we're weighted more heavily at the other end of the scale, at the big stuff, if you like. I don't think we're weighted enough at the bottom end. But again, it goes back to what I was saying. So if drugs affect your family, right? So if you've been impacted by drugs, at some point, that person in your family got hooked by a dealer, right? Whether that was through a friend, whether that was through a passing in the street or whatever, they got hooked by a dealer. So every drug problem starts with a dealer on the streets. And the less dealers there are on the streets has to have a positive impact. So if we can fund a specialist drug operation unit, for example, that is aimed purely at taking low-level dealers off the streets and having a zero tolerance approach to street dealing, then we will naturally have less new customers. And we talk about a new drug customer, whereas what we should be saying is, well, that's a new impacted family. That's another family that's going to have their lives ruined through drugs. And for every one of them we save, for me, that's a massive box ticked.
Do you feel as though we should be, well, not necessarily harsher, but do you feel as though we should be harsher on those dealing the drugs and affecting the families, and I guess more compassionate towards drug users and people who are in possession and taken for?
Absolutely. So for me, I am never going to criticize a drug user. Right? That's not what I'm about. Every time, and I get pulled sometimes because sometimes the language I use people feel is inappropriate. So I've been publicly, and I've talked about drug dealers being scum and low life and this, that, and the other, because that's how I see them. That's what I feel. That's not the people that get hooked. If you get hooked on drugs, you are a victim of crime. The crime is selling you that drug. Now, do I think those who do get hooked should be helped? Yes, but I think that's a public health issue, and that's not a police and crime issue. The police's job is to stop those drugs being delivered and sold in the first place. It's a public health issue, those people that are already hooked. And I do understand the difference, and I see it, but I think too many people try and convolute the two, and they think the Police and Crime Commissioner's job is to support addicts. It's not. It's to catch criminals, and addicts aren't criminals, drug dealers are.
Yeah. Now, I think that, and I don't necessarily know how much truth is in this statement, so I think I'll just make it with a side of caution. But I do hear sometimes the story that goes, you've got somebody, they're living at home, they have poor education, they're not very well educated or have experience, and they feel as though they aren't living very well. They're on the breadline. They're not getting enough from the government, or they don't feel as though they're making ends meet, and as a result, they turn to drug dealing. And I think that there are two different types of drug dealers. There are drug dealers who, do really well, and they're all flashy and they're all show off, and it's gaudy and avaricious, and that's in your face. And then there's people who are genuinely feeling poor and desolate and can't get out of this rut, and they turn to drugs and drug selling because it seems like an easy route. It seems like somewhere to pull in some money to help themselves. And to some degree, the latter seem like ones who we should treat with more compassion, like the drug users, as opposed to the more gaudy, full in your face drug dealers who just show off and flaunt about. Do you feel as though there is a distinction to be made there?
No, because I think everybody's got a choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are lots of people that struggle for a variety of reasons, whether that's through lifestyle, whether that's through mental health, whether that's through choice. It's just circumstance that there are millions of people that struggle, and they don't all turn to dealing drugs because it's easy. Right? Yeah, they go out. I've done it myself. I spent 15, 16-year-old working 2 jobs to make ends meet, things like that. And when I had kids, I was working all the hours God's end, looking for overtime. And these were in low-paid manual jobs when I was very young. Mm-hmm. And those options are tough to come by, but I don't buy the fact that people sell drugs because they have no other option. There is always a choice. And even if the choice is sitting at home on your hands, watching daytime telly, right, that's a choice. Selling drugs is a choice, and anybody that chooses to sell drugs is a criminal.
Well, and then just to take it a little bit further, just to push the boat out one last time, how about people who are, let's say, 15, 16, 17 years old, young and impressionable, and they get groomed by a drug dealer who shows them the fancy clothes, shows them the fancy car, shows them the fancy watches. The parents aren't responsible enough to notice that. And then young, impressionable kids get pulled into the drug game, pulled into the drug rings, get caught up in debt, crime, and all of the issues that come with that. And then when they, mature into adults, 18, 19, 20 onwards, how do we account for them? Because clearly, to some extent, there is a choice, but there is also coercion and an element of being brought into it.
And there's pressure and there's grooming, and I get all of those things. And yes, you've got to take every single situation on its merits. But what I would challenge you is, if we're doing the job and we're taking low-level dealers off the streets, and we're doing that, and so you take Johnny off the street and then you talk to him, and you understand his circumstance, he's been groomed, he's been got there and what have you, then you've got to look at that and say, right, well, how can we support that? However, if he's back on the streets tomorrow, or if he's back on the streets at the weekend and he's doing that again, then you can't just say, oh, well, it's because he didn't have a choice, because actually he has still got a choice. And very rarely do you come across a 15, 16, 17-year-old that doesn't know what they're doing is wrong. Mm. And that's, you've got to find, and to be fair, knife crime's similar. You see young kids as young as 10 and 11 carrying knives. Now, I would say to them, those are the types of kids we've got to support, and we've got to educate, and we've got to help about the dangers of that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a 15, 16-year-old and you're carrying a knife, you know you're carrying a knife, and you've got to be dealt with differently.
Yeah, and criminal responsibility in current our current jurisdiction is 10, isn't it? 10, I think, from the Jamie Bulger case. So it's one of them ones where we have said that from 10 onwards you're responsible criminally for your own actions. Therefore, if you are 15, 16, 17 and you are doing these things, then to some extent you are liable. To move on a little bit, do you feel as though the attitudes towards the police have changed over the past few decades? And one thing that Barry mentioned, well, me wrongly to some extent, I feel as though I conflated the US police system with the UK, or at least I gave that impression. And do you feel as though public perception does get Americanized a little bit with the UK police force and leads to worse? Yeah.
Absolutely. So we and I'm sure Barry talked about it. In this country, we police by a principle of consent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So basically, our public consent to be policed by our police officers in some respects. That's always been the case. That since Robert Peel came in, that's what we've done. Now that works when there is a massive element of respect for our police officers. When our police officers lose that respect for a whole host of different reasons, then it becomes more difficult, because then the choice of the police officer is very black and white. It's either I let you do something that's illegal or I arrest you for it. And if I arrest you, am I inflaming the situation? So I sometimes watch in horror when I see these protests that end up turning into riots and this and the other, because of the element within that, not the people that genuinely set the process up 9 times out of 10, but the people that come to these things with a view of wanting more than just a peaceful protest. And then our police are very much in a catch-22, and you see it, and people say, oh, the police were heavy-handed. Rarely do I see an incident where the police are heavy-handed in a situation that hasn't got out of hand. There's always something that sparks it, and as often it's one person that pushes the envelope. The police take that person into custody, often forcefully, and then other elements within the Crown take offence at that. So then it's a snowball effect. Mm-hmm. And that's because we've lost respect for the police. Now, part of the reason I think we've lost respect for the police is because we've taken some of their powers away, not in terms of law, but police officers will happily arrest a criminal, but then too often that criminal is let back out on the streets through no fault of their own, whether that's red tape, whether it's leniency within the justice system, whether that's a good lawyer that finds a loophole or this, that, and the other. So people start to look at that and say, what's the point, right? What's the point of our police? So, and then I feel for officers that say, well, I can arrest him, right? Or I can arrest her, but I haven't got enough evidence to charge. So they'll be back out in the streets in an hour. So what's the point of me arresting them? And all the public see is they didn't arrest that person. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a balance to be found somewhere between having a show of force from our police officers, which will gain them the respect from the vast majority of the population if they're seen to be coming down tougher on the minority. Mm-hmm. But in doing so, there is a minority that will rail at that. And when they do so, there'll always be stories where somebody got it wrong. Mm-hmm. So that there might be 10 arrests and one of them will be, you sort of look at that and think, oh, that was a bit heavy-handed, maybe we didn't do it like that. But that's the one that will get the high profile. Mm-hmm. And social media is a massive thing now. People go on social media now and they'll report a crime to Facebook before they'll report it to their police.
Yeah.
And they'll tell the world that the police have done nothing, when in reality their first port of call is social media rather than 101.
Yeah, and publicly executed on social media. I see. So I was talking to my girlfriend about this quite a while back, because you do see on YouTube and social media, you'll see videos where a police officer will pull somebody over and then they'll record the conversation, and then they'll pull up the police officer on different pieces of the road traffic act and say, you're prescribing the law incorrectly here and here. You're not abiding by this section. You're not doing this, this, and the other. And you will see quite a few of them videos. And me and my girlfriend were saying, is that because the current entry-level police officers and the training that they get is worse, and therefore police officers aren't as good with the law and good with legislation, or there's just more exposure to that now through social media? Or do you think that I'm being a bit, I'm creating a bit of a false dichotomy there? It's neither or.
It's probably a combination of all three, if I'm honest. I think we do have, because of the nature of policing, the days where a police officer would join and then do 30 years is probably less and less now than it used to be. So by the very nature, you will have less experienced officers out there, and if you've got less experience, you've obviously got newer officers coming in. I think the training they receive is I don't think it's any better or worse than it's ever been. I think they get a good level, but the law is so diverse and everybody has access to a courtroom. So literally you can watch a YouTube video, transcribe what the officer said into Google, and it will tell you which law it refers to and whether it was said correctly or done correctly or whatever. So that side of it, these police officers are making split-second decisions based on what they've got, and then they're saying, right, I'm arresting you because of. And for me, as long as they are within the scope of that, I think the absolute detailed analysis of that needs to be looked at subjectively and said, right, well, actually, did that person commit this offence? Yes. Did that officer make a lawful arrest? Yes. Was the wording of that arrest slightly askew from what it potentially should have been? Yes. But did that fundamentally change something? So if you're driving your car at 100 mile an hour and a 30 mile speed limit, and the police officer doesn't say the right words as he puts you in the back of the car and says you could have killed somebody there, does that change the fact that you were doing 100 mile an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone? No, it doesn't. Yeah.
No, I understand that completely. Do you feel as though ego gets in the way a little bit with police officers, where they'll pull somebody over and you might get somebody who's a bit chewy or a bit aggressive, and if they pull you up on the law and if they say to you, or you're wrong because of this statute, you haven't said this thing, you haven't done this thing, do you feel as though police officers should know when to calm themselves and not let their own personal ego get in the way, get inflated, and then act out a little bit and act a bit more aggressively? Do you feel as though there is some tension there?
I have never, and unfortunately, I've never been arrested. So I have never seen a situation where a police officer's ego got in the way. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I couldn't personally say that's that. And I don't hear a lot of it. That's not. I've been campaigning now for about 16 months, and I have rarely had anything in my inbox to say an officer's ego was a problem. I see all sorts of issues, whether officers weren't compassionate potentially, whether officers didn't give the answers that were expected, whether officers in some respects maybe just didn't follow through properly for whatever reason. That rarely comes down to ego. Sometimes it comes down to inadequacy, but rarely down to ego from what I see.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a silly question, and I am going to admit that in preface first. But
I love the question.
But I think it can act as a bit of a microcosm for a broader issue. If hypothetically, police officers got more of a worse rep, and if people chose not to go into the police force as much, or over the next 5 to 10 years, we have fewer police officers on the road, and it got to a point where, the ratio of police officer to civilian and the ratio to response time and crime became so far removed that it was almost impossible to actually enforce any laws or to look after anybody or care for emergencies. How would we as a country deal with that sort of issue if it ever came down to being completely understaffed and completely under-resourced?
I don't think we'll ever get to that point. So that's first, because at the minute, probably, if you talk to lots of local people, the problem they've got is they've applied for the police force, and they're either waiting for recruitment windows to open, or we haven't got them quick enough. Our problem with recruitment in Cleveland at the minute is we're not getting to people quick enough who want to be police officers. Not that we can't get people to be police officers. So even with the way the job is at the minute, there is still a real appetite for people to join and to come on board. So I don't envisage that scenario happening. If you get to some type of apocalypse, if you like, and we get to the point where we do that, then you've always, as a country, you've always got your army to fall back on. There's all sorts of different things, but I cannot envisage a situation where we would ever be in that point.
Yeah, that's why I said it was a stupid question, because I knew it probably was ultimately, but it's we're throwing out there. Do you feel
a good point recruitment though? The recruitment is a good point, because we've one of the misconceptions over Cleveland Police over the last few years is the fact that because we lost officers, all of our ills are down to that. When the reality is, we could have had more officers than we actually had, because we had a budget sat there and we just didn't have an aggressive recruitment program. And we leave officers sat on any given. Cleveland at the minute, I think the complement of about 1,450 officers, something like that. And there are between 10 and 20% of fully warranted officers sat in back office jobs. So I think there's a pool there as well that we haven't tapped into, and sort of said, what can those be? How can those roles be done differently? Yeah,
I do like think from my own perspective that there's always going to be people that want to be police officers, and there's always going to be good people that we're looking to protect. And I can't ever see us getting to a point where we're not going to have enough police officers for enough people. It was just something I'll throw out there. Now, I worked last year. I worked in York, actually, before COVID. It's all muddled up now, but before then, I worked in York. I worked in the York train station as a security guard, and we worked with the British Transport Police. And I was speaking to one of the police officers there, and we got chatting, and we got onto the subject of trauma and some of the horrific incidents that police have to show up to. He was talking about a suicide, and it just sounded jarring. And he said that the current system that they have in place is called TRIM, and some police officers can apply for TRIM and wait weeks before they actually get into that counselling. And he told me that, it's quite a sad story. He told me, and this is Yorkshire Police, it wasn't Cleveland Police or North Yorkshire Police, but he essentially told me that one of his colleagues had went to a suicide, and that suicide was his colleague's friend, and she was completely distraught by that, as you would be. And she never got into TRIM for 3 months, and in that time she killed herself. And he was quite upset at the fact that she couldn't get a counselling. So do you feel as though the current counselling and the current mental health services in place for the police is adequate and fit for purpose?
No, I think there's always more we can do. Cleveland Police is one of the few forces in the country that's actually got a fully warranted officer in their blue light mental health support unit. So they've got somebody that understands that from the front line and knows what needs doing. So that he tends to be the first point of call for that. But I think you are dead right. And one of the ways we see the impact of that, because again, over the last several years, Cleveland Force has had one of the worst sickness records of any other force in the country for a whole host of different reasons. And then what you need to do is, every time we've got an officer on the sick, at that point, we're then one down on the streets as well. And by improving that service, by giving those officers the support they need sooner, they invariably get back to normal duties sooner as well. So it's a double-edged sword, really. We are doing the right thing by our officers by offering them that support, but by offering them that support, we get them back on the streets quicker, which improves our public-facing perception.
And do police officers who suffer trauma or suffer anything ancillary, do they currently get enough time off work and enough time off work without the pressure to go back to work, do you feel?
I don't think you can answer that question. I think every person is different. So you'll know people in your own life. So you might lose a loved one, and some people cope with that by throwing themselves into their work, and other people cope with that by taking themselves away and isolating themselves completely. And I think the same with our police officers. Depending on the situation, if you turn up at a suicide, that's going to impact whoever you are. If you turn up at a friend's suicide, then that's horrendous, and no impact on that as well. But every person's going to be different, so every person might look at it. And I think with any form of trauma, if there's an element of that trauma that relates to you personally for whatever reason, so you might turn up at to a dead body and that looks like a relative of yours or a family member, and that might impact you because you think, oh well, God, my heart was in my mouth there and I thought it was this person. But you might turn up at another police officer might turn up at the same place, see no resemblance, or there's nothing in that scene that links to anything in their life or their lifestyle, and they will cope with that differently. So two officers could turn up at exactly the same situation, and one could be genuinely affected far more seriously than the other one, just because it triggered something in their own mentality.
Yeah, I think the thing that sort of upsets me, and it is just part of the job admittedly, is that a police officer could go to a suicide or could go to any horrific incident and then take a few weeks off work, go back to work, and then literally on the first day back come up to something again. You know, if you're working in an office, or if you're working anywhere really else apart from maybe doctors or fire brigade or the military, you're likely not going to be potentially subjected straight back to the trauma as soon as you come back. You know, you can go back to the office and you're probably not going to, you know, come across something bad again. And that's one thing that I do think is quite upsetting. And like I said, it's just part and parcel of the job. And touching on that, I've always thought that, you know, you could be a beat officer, you could be in your car, you could be driving about checking stuff, and you can go from 0 to 100. You could be, you know, driving over Newport Bridge, not a care in the world, all week, everything's been fine, you've just been sorting things out, been taken over, and then some Audi goes screeching past you. Then all of a sudden you're in a 80, 100 mile per hour car chase up small roads, and then you pull somebody over and they could have a knife on them. And do you feel as though the way that a person has to adjust quickly and rapidly to the rush of adrenaline and the change of circumstance, they feel as though the way that the police are trained in dealing with that is adequate, and they feel as though it's fit for purpose?
I would say yes is the short answer. Like I said, I think we've got some excellent officers, and that 0 to 100 mile an hour thing is part and parcel of what being a police officer is. But you could say that about lots of hours. So you could say that if you're a firefighter, you might spend 7 hours of your night shift trying to get your head down, and all of a sudden that bell goes and you're there and you're pulling people out of a burning building. So I think you've got that in that. You see that in the armed forces. You talk to anybody that spent time in the military, and the vast majority of their time is spent sort of combating boredom in some respects. But the percentage of their time that isn't is right on the wire. So it does take a special type of person. And I think sometimes that's why you touched on ego earlier on, and sometimes police officers might come across as egotistical or as arrogant potentially and what have you. But I think in some respects, you've got to breed a level of confidence into our officers, and that's confidence in their ability and confidence in their manner to handle any given situation, that to an ordinary member of the public, that doesn't have to go from 0 to 100 mile an hour all ever in their life. And sometimes that comes across and people don't understand that and mistake it for arrogance or mistake it for ego, when in reality it's just a breed of confidence that you're doing a very special job, and it takes a very special person with a very special attitude to do it.
Yeah, and I think that there's been an advent now of more it's a bit different, but a bit like cybercrime, and I think with that, there's a whole new different type of police officer that we need to start looking for. You need to start looking for people who are actually going to be trained through computer systems and trained onto how to handle crimes digitally. But before, what I was going to say, I completely forgot about it, Steve. Sorry, but I was actually going to say, touching on that last point I've just remembered. So, do you feel as though there should be some physical requirements to get into the police? And I know that there are, but they feel as though, because I know Barry said that there used to be a height limit, and we've took that away. And it seemed as though, I'm not commenting on, but it seemed as though he felt as though that it should have been enforced and that getting rid of it was a bad thing. Do you feel as though we should have physical requirements to go into the police force?
I don't think we should have physical requirements in terms of size and shape, but I do believe we should have physical requirements in terms of a fitness test, of a strength test, if you like, of the ability to do the job, because you are called upon. And funny enough, a similar question came up. I did a talk at Billingham Sixth Form last week, and a similar question came up about female officers. And I said, well, for me, it's not about whether an officer is male or female, it's about their ability to do the job. And the majority of female police officers I've ever met are perfectly capable of doing that job, right? So they may be slightly smaller or slightly slighter than others, but they are trained and they are able to do a particular job in a particular way. But then the other qualities of that, so you look at, there's many aspects of policing. So not every frontline police officer is expected to wrestle someone to the ground. You've got armed response unit officers where it's more about mental strength as well, and and training rather than physical strength. You've got dog handling, you've got CID, which is very analytical and things like that. You've got drone pilots now who are looking at that and need to have a touch and a feel for working things. I watched a programme on the tail last week about the North Yorkshire had the country's first female off-road bike police officer, and she'd been a motorbike champion cyclist for years before she joined the police force. So all of these things, I think there is a place for everybody, but I do think there has to be a basic level of physical ability, not necessarily physical size and shape.
Do you feel that, and I don't want to say overweight, because you can be overweight and still be relatively healthy. Do you feel as though an obese police officer, even from public perception, should not be on the streets dealing with beat work where you might have to chase somebody?
I think you've got to look at what's classified. I'm a former rugby player, so I know there are some big lads that are classed as clinically obese by any measure you like, who will run and run and run for 80 minutes and give you everything, and then be back the next day coaching kids, right? So I think it's unfair to define somebody by their shape or their physical appearance. But if that obese person can't run and complete a certain level on a bleep test, if they can't carry the gear they need to on a forced shield run, for example, which is one of the tests I've seen done, if they can't do that, then yes, they need to fitness to a level where they can.
I think that the problem there comes with public perception. They'll see what appears to be an overweight, out of shape police officer and assume that they won't be able to run or chase or actually fight crime properly, when in fact they are every week doing bleep tests, every week doing running and stamina training, cardiovascular health, keeping it at a good quality. So yeah, definitely, I think that's more so of a perception as opposed to.
I think naturally where you get to is if you set those rigorous performance standards within your police officers, and again, that's an operational thing. Again, it's not the police police and crime commissioner's role to sort of tell the chief constable, well, actually, I don't think the officers are fit enough. Right? But from that perspective, if those officers are achieving that level of fitness, the likelihood is, in the vast majority of them, they are conforming to a perception of what fit looks like.
Yeah, and I do want to raise things up a little bit, because I do feel as though I might be talking a bit too much about the day-to-day operational things, and I feel as though I want to hone back in on the police and crime commissioner role and the responsibilities that you take on if you were elected. So what would be your plan, and what would be your what would you do? What the first day, the first roles, the first weeks, what would you do specifically if you were elected?
I think first and foremost, there's two things need to happen. So firstly, you have to sit with the chief constable and understand chapter and verse where the force is operationally, right? Where he sees his challenges, where he sees his priorities, and the plan he's working on currently. What you've also got to do as part of that meeting is you've got to be very honest and lay out to the chief constable what your priorities are. So I've talked at length about the fact that I want to come down hard on street drug dealing. I want us to combat violence and antisocial behaviour. I want to take a zero tolerance approach to things like off-road motorbikes. And I want to make sure that we're supporting victims properly wherever we can. And then overarching all of that, I want to see initiatives and programs that support young people to make sure we've got outreach programs and we're going out and we're engaging with young people. So all of those things, I think, those cards need to be laid on the table day one between me, if elected, and the chief constable, because he needs to understand what I need him to achieve, but I also need to understand what he's currently working on and how that fits into what I want to do. Do
you feel as though there are any areas over Cleveland, maybe smaller villages like Skinning Grove or Loftus or wherever, you know, little smaller areas that aren't as urban? Do you feel as though police have a harder time getting there, or there isn't as much reach or scope that the police can have an influence? Or do you feel as though it is currently, you know, spread out effectively?
No, I think there's two ways of looking at it. So the vast majority of Cleveland Force area could be classified as rural. In terms of actual physical size and shape, we could be classed as rural. The bulk of our crime is concentrated on the urban areas, however. So that's where the bulk of our policing is. Now, what that gives you is a challenge in those rural communities. And I've worked for the last 4 years with councillors and locals in East Cleveland on their policing, and there's some councillors that have done some fantastic work out in East Cleveland to put pressure on their MP, to put pressure on the chief constable, to put pressure on the PCC to get better support for their communities. And they've had some success with that. And I think we can take that further. And I think one of the things I want to do around technology is I want to bring in a smartphone app that allows you to report crime almost instantly. Now, that's not going to mean you get a police officer out to Boozbeck any quicker than you would do now. But if you report crime more often and more people report the same types of crime in the same types of area, that generates a pattern and it generates hotspots that allow our police force to target those areas. So you will naturally see more police officers in those areas if you are reporting more crime. Yeah,
that makes sense. I do feel as though, from my own perspective, I've always lived in Middlesbrough. I live like Linthorpe, just at the end of town. And when I was a kid, growing up on the estate that I grew up on, I did feel as though, and I can't remember his name, but we did have a local police officer, and my mum knew him, and you know, I did feel like that presence was there more, and you know, going out and about, you'd see more police officers on foot walking about, and now it feels as though there's a big separation between the public and the police. They're always in the car, they're always, driving past, looking out with us looking at them, and it's separated by the car, etc. And I don't know. I do feel as though that separation shouldn't necessarily be the thing. I think that community and police should coexist together harmoniously, and we should know our police officers locally, and we should see police officers out on the beat. And do you think that's an issue?
I think neighbourhood policing's been an issue, and one of the reasons for that is the previous chief constable and the previous PCC made a conscious decision to remove neighbourhood policing and effectively leave it in the hands of PCSOs and put all of that resource into response policing. And it was fundamentally a terrible decision. And we lost a lot of officers from neighbourhoods. We're now trying to reverse that and put them back. But what you've got now is we're struggling to backfill those officers. So we've got officers that want to go into neighbourhood roles, experienced officers that want to go in neighbourhood roles, but we're not getting the recruitment through quick enough to backfill them. Now, it's not a question of we haven't got the numbers, it's a question of we can't physically fill those spaces quick enough to get that done. And then I also think that the neighbourhood beat, the Bobby on the beat, if you like, is important, but sometimes we've got to be realistic as well and say, well, it's great having an officer walking down the street, but if 90% of the reported crimes are off-road bikes or drug dealers in cars, that officer on the beat isn't going to catch those people, right? So we need an operation. We need to look at the types of crime that have been reported and assess where they're better. Where the flip side of that is, however, is you need that information a community Bobby brings you. So if your mum knew the name of your police officer in your area when you were growing up, and she passed them in the street and said, oh, do you know that bike that's been tearing up and down the street with that young lad on it with no helmet? He lives at number 14. That type of information is invaluable. And that's what we lose when we've got officers in the car. So we've got to have a balance. Now, I think PCSOs do a fantastic job of that community link. Right. So I think PCSOs who are out gathering information, turning up at community meetings, providing newsletters for the public and things like that, that's a fantastic use of a resource we've got in space. What we've got to do is make sure that those PCSOs, whenever they're out walking those streets, are supported by officers that can be there immediately. So not necessarily walking alongside them, but if you've got two PCSOs on the beat in X area on a Friday night, then realistically, that neighbourhood or the wider neighbourhood should also be being patrolled by two fully warranted officers, a response car that can be there within minutes of that call being put in. Because at the minute, sometimes we don't see that. Yeah. But again, we're straight into operational policing, and you've got to set the strategy. So,
so for a broader issue, then, more encompassing, as I mentioned earlier, cybercrime and what's happening online in the digital world. Now, I know for a fine fact that the judiciary and the legislation has not caught up properly, or at least not very well, when it comes to cybercrime. And that's just due to the fact that there are a lot of advances in cybercrime day to day, and a lot of people in the Commons and the Lords don't really have a technical understanding, which is neither here nor there. But do you feel as though policing is moving more towards digital and cyber? And what are your thoughts on that? And how would you work to effectively govern and police cyber crimes and cyber issues?
I think the important way of looking at that is they are crimes, right? So it's another theatre that the police need to operate in. So whether you're in a community, whether you're policing a high street at kicking out time, whether you're in a digital space, you need officers that understand how and when those crimes occur and how to detect and deter them. And so you treat it no differently to any other crime, in the fact that you want specialist officers that are trained on how to deal with it appropriately.
Okay, yeah, I understood. Is there anything else, Steve, that you'd like to go over or discuss? If not, then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that my friend wanted me to push across, taken from the audience. Don't represent my views. But is there anything else that you'd like to go over and discuss?
No, let's go for questions.
Okay, so what are your views on cannabis?
It's currently illegal in this country, and as such should be treated in the same way as any other drug of its type.
And do you think that it should be legalized, or do you think that the current climate with it is something that we don't want to discuss at the moment and there's bigger issues?
I would never personally campaign to legalize cannabis.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I don't take it myself. It's just a question. The other one was, I know I didn't phrase this quite well with Barry, admittedly, so I'll try and phrase it a bit better. But with us coming out of restrictions and with COVID lifting, we might be able to reasonably assume that with more nightlife, there's going to be a higher level of crime. And I'm correlating that as part of the question. If so, how do you think that engaging with policing surrounding knife crime can be done adequately without stifling knife crime? Sorry, not knife crime, nightlife.
Yeah, nightlife.
Talking over myself, nightlife, yeah, without stifling nightlife.
I think as a general rule, we know how to police nightlife. We've been doing it for years. As we come out of restrictions, and we've seen it a little bit over the last week with outdoor entertainment being allowed. I think what you get is there's an initial rush. There will always be people that overindulge. There will always be people that sort of go out and aren't prepared to play nice, if you like. You're going to get that side of it. I think our police know how to do that, and I don't think coming out of COVID will be any worse than before we went into it. I don't see that correlation, and in some respects, I think there may also be some benefits in the fact that some people have got so used to a different lifestyle, whether that's entertaining them at home, in their gardens, whether that's just enjoying your own company, whether that's watching digital music online rather than going to see live music, whatever that looks like. I think there's lots of things people have tried. The fact that we're stood here doing a podcast today is something that 12 months ago, 18 months ago, I'd have probably come and sat in your studio and we'd have talked across a desk.
Yeah.
Well, I think things have changed, and I think we'll see a difference. But when it comes to nightlife, I don't think we're going to be needing to teach our officers anything new.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I can certainly see where you're coming from there as well. Is there anything else that you'd like to go over or discuss? If not, then we can call it a day now.
No, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks
Yeah.
for inviting me. It was you're never quite sure when I've done quite a lot of these now, and you're never quite sure what you're going to get.
I know.
Whatever.
I try and be as professional and on topic as possible. I'm not going to talk to you about UFOs, don't worry. But
I think the only thing I would say, Joe, is it's a really important election for a whole host of reasons. We've got a failing police force, and we have to put that right. And too many people in our communities feel they've been let down at the moment, and it's a tough choice. Somebody has to, whether you believe in the PCC role or not, it's happening. The election's happening. One of 4 people is going to be the police and crime commissioner for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
And it's about who we choose to do that job, based on who we think will do that job best. And that's what it is. So however people choose to vote, that's great. We live in a democratic society. Yeah. But go out and use that vote and have your say in how you think our police force should be run.
Yeah, and I strongly advise everybody to go out and vote. Get out there. The election's May 6th. It's not long now. It's 9 days or so. So it is really something that is imperative and important. And I really hope that we see more turnout rates, not just locally, but across the whole nation. I really do hope that we're taking this more seriously and things come to a better light ultimately. I think I'm good now. Yeah, I'm happy. Honestly, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I would have liked to have spoke with Matt and Chris. Chris did get back to me on an email and said that he'd like to do it, but he just hasn't responded since. It would have been nice to have all four of you guys here and debate, and I would have liked that. It would have been a bit of fun to sit and moderate that. But I'm really genuinely happy. Thank you for your time, and
no problem.
I'll call it there now. Thank you very much.
All right, cheers, Joe. Thank you.